Welcome, everyone, to the Making of a Nobody. I'm your host, Sejal Thacker, and we're continuing the conversation that we started last week. So, welcome back, Nick. Great to see you.
Great to see you, Sejal. Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course. It's always a pleasure to share space with you. And so, last week we started this conversation about how do we take an idea, it starts as a concept and get it to reality. And so today we're going to dig it a little bit deeper and talk about some other points as well about, the dynamics that exist between a startup and a venture capitalist. So understanding this relationship is something that's so important because it could really, impact the trajectory of a company. And so I wanted to pick up with a question that we got right before we dropped last week from Ganzafar Khan. I got it right. I know I practiced it a couple of times to make sure I got that right. And what he asked was, it's a big question. And so we responded to him in chat and said, look, we've talked about this on numerous Nobody Studios live streams. They're all at Nobody Crowd. But his question was, I just wanted to add a few things, right, to his question. So he said, what is your strategy, or at least some of the underlying principles and values to build processes and systems that will enable you to build 100 companies in 5 years? And so again, this is a big question, but some of the things I jotted down, Ganzafar, were, one of the things that's really differentiates us from some of the other venture studios, and I think is really our secret sauce, is that we're crowd infused, right? We really leverage the power of our global crowd. So we, for some of you that have been following us, we did an equity crowdfunding campaign and we got over 900 investors in 55 countries. And so we're going to be using this crowd to save us time and cost, right? We have a model that we've created called the Frugressive model that allows us to build companies faster and leaner so that we have a higher success rate, as compared to a traditional startup. And also, I think some of the other important things, is that we are always looking at how do we continually improve our sort of prototyping so that we're doing it even quicker, and that we test ideas, we experiment, and we validate these ideas to help us get that to, market while we're getting the real-time feedback. And Nick and I, we talked about this last week, and Mark McNally, our chief nobody, and Andy Walsh, our VP of incubation, joined us last week. And, we were talking about how we want to make sure we use real-time feedback. And so having this crowd really helps us do that quickly, right? Also, we really have a lean approach, right? We want to make sure we use our resources efficiently and minimize time and resources, right? So we're looking at how do we create value quickly and innovate in a way that hasn't been done before. And that's the other thing, is we're not just trying to do things. Our VP of research, always, Donald Farmer, he always says, look, we're not just trying to do things better than what's already being done. We're looking at ways of how can we do things differently. And how can we create these processes that are scalable and flexible that allows us to adapt, right? So I just gave you some of the points. I don't know, Nick, if you want to add anything to that question, but just some of the few highlights.
Yeah, no, you summarized it pretty well. What we do at the studio, in what terms we think and do things differently. And, sometimes it's never just doing something for the sake of doing it better, faster, cheaper. It's not that, that is a kind of a everywhere spread innovation pattern. What we're looking at is completely different angle. The different angle that allows you to see a different future after that company, a different world if the company exists or not, an enablement for some other companies for more services. That's the different angle. That's the differentiator.
Thank you.
And the crowd, just to close on that, the global crowd, the global presence, this expanding presence in different countries and continents just gives us multiple perspectives. Because what we recognize at the studio, is that probably the next big ideas are going to come from the places where currently the majority is not looking at. And we need everybody's perspective. We need to figure out how to feed 10 billion people in the years to come. and more of these global challenges. So different perspectives just help us to expand the reach and collecting ideas and perspectives.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And I'll just add one more point. I really think that it's this sort of collaborative culture that we're building at the studio, right? So that we can embrace all the diverse ideas from all over the globe, right?
Really.
And so again, this is kind of how we're looking at doing things differently, is building some of these things right in as we're building the machine, right? And so that's where we left off actually, Nick, last week, is we were talking about, okay, now we're going to scale the product, right? And so I wanted to start off with this one question. It's how important is it to stay true to your initial user base, right, while you're scaling your product?
Yeah, this is actually a big question, right? So the first users, the initial user base, that works with you at the beginning of a project, at the beginning of a company, is effectively the set of people who are basically not only the early adopters of what you do, but also the brand ambassadors. So they most probably share the values that your company, that your new venture is trying to push into the world. And so this is a huge source of, stickiness to them. These are the people who are gonna tell you about the bugs. We're gonna tell you about the new features. They are gonna tell you about candid feedback so that you can improve and expand. So brand advocacy, is a huge component of this. And as long as you stick to the core values, I think that is a very good way to keep the initial user base close to you. And one of the, let's say, also usages of this in scaling, if you want to talk about using this, it is effectively like this, proving the market validation, proving it's kind of proof of concept for, let's say, when we talk about scaling, it's also, I would already think of VC involvement, and in this area, having users that are sticking to your product, sticking to the company values, is already proof of concept for the product, and also establishing a track record of doing something, of the early traction, and early users. And these are no more vanity metrics for a startup. These are concrete users that are starting to get as close as possible to your team, and also, they can allow you to say, to make early projections on predictable revenue streams, on you can make some mitigation risks actions around this, because you have the numbers to start make plans finally. And that's something VC like to see. That's one of the biggest components, I would say. And the other one, building on the feedback and building on what you're gonna do with that feedback is actually, as long as you stay close and aligned to the core features and values that along the brand made the people sticking with you, there is also this signature experience in the quality of the interactions with the product. This is gonna retain these users. This is gonna balance this expansion, the loyalty while you expand. And that's all part of all the things we can do around this. Maybe being a bit enlarging already this, but that's my point of view around how to stay true to the original user base.
I think you've made so many good points there. I mean, it's super important, right, to stay loyal to the people that these are the people that are going to support you, and they're going to give you resources, right? I mean, again, talking about the investors from that campaign, now these are the same people. I think of them as sort of our supporters, right? And they're helping us recruit now. They're bringing us talent. They're opening up their networks to help us succeed as a studio. So it's the same thing for, when you're doing it for a product, right? Like, these are the people that initially saw the vision, bought into the vision, and they're going to be your biggest cheerleaders. And so you started to go this in your answer, and that leads me right into the second question I had for you was that now we need money, right? We need to partner with, Mark and I always talk about like the venture capitalists, the VCs are kind of like our partners, right? Because like at the studio, we're going to take the companies to a certain point, and then we're going to lean on our VCs to help us fund that company. And so help us understand, how do these investments really help shape the product development roadmap?
Right, the product development. Yeah, this is another huge question, huge point. Interesting questions today. Thank you. So, I would say that this is a very critical role for VCs in the measure that they can impact the product development roadmap. Depending on the funding, of course, and depending on how advanced is what you have when the VC enters the game, and when they become part of your journey. In the initial stages, in the initial funding, for instance, in the early stages, the funding is super crucial for transforming more of the ideas you have and more of the things you've got in the roadmap, which I treat as a sort of a plan. This is a plan that you're committing on executing. And so first thing first, as a product person, I can tell you should never put ideas in the roadmap. You should put a plan. The roadmap is the plan, is the execution of what's going on or what will be done. And with this being said, if the alignment with the VC is in place, the capital will be primarily used for this product development, for hiring the key staff and setting up the infrastructure to make this plan a reality, to make all that you have in the roadmap real, scalable, and that can bring not only the product but the company to the next stage. It can also be used to, depending on, I would say, how in the early stages, how much in the early stages the VC funding enters the game. That could also be scaling from an MVP to a full product, or from a product release 1 to product release 2, or from an MVP to software as a service if we're talking about a digital product, or anyway, accelerating the development, enhancing the product capabilities, getting super fast to market. These are all stuff that you can do with funding. And timing in the super competitive landscape where we are is one of the biggest and probably the most important factor, because you're not the only one building. There are a lot of smart people around the world, and 99% don't work with you on building that, and ultimately driving the startup success, I would say.
Yeah, I would love, I would love to hear if you can think of, from your own experience, like, can you share maybe an example of when, VC provided funding that helped to accelerate a product feature that proved to be a game changer for a company? Maybe you could share an example.
Yeah, maybe from notable companies, companies we now know and let's say give for granted, and that became part of our lives. From the world of AI and let's say the word that is closest to me, I can maybe mention probably Spotify. I remember when Spotify started to, they were one of the many players in the streaming industry, but at a certain point they had this was a point of inflection in the market where we started to see a lot of custom models. Machine learning started to be a real thing, scalable, repeatable. We could already see results, and they fundraised in one of their major investment stages. They made a game-changing pivot, and not only they were making the streaming, but they started to do to develop these sophisticated algorithms that personalize the user experience and started to suggest musics to the users. And this became one of the best and let's say signature features for Spotify. We all know Spotify for the company that helps us, discover new music according to our tastes. But this was not their original version, their original mission and vision. This came along the way and was only possible with funding, and maybe even for Zoom during pandemic. It became obvious that they needed to scale. They could scale and become almost the player of, let's say, they could provide video conferencing experience not only to enterprise, which was their original market, but to consumers. And we all know how many Zoom calls we had during pandemic and following that. So all these enablements or this scale up were only possible with VC funds.
Yeah, but you mentioned something when you were talking, that I think is a tricky dilemma that you run into, right? Like, what happens when you have VC that's giving you feedback on your product, and maybe it's not aligned with what your original vision is, right? So how do you decide whether you stick with your original VC or you pivot based on the feedback that you're getting? And I'm sure that this is really tricky, and this is something that a lot of people are probably dealing with. So what are some tips to help founders navigate this situation?
Well, remember who you are, I would say. First thing first, like remembering like where you're coming from. What was the mission when you started? What is the vision? Everything has to stay aligned with the vision, and understanding the core vision and stay true to that is probably the first thing that comes to mind. And you should always listen to VC. You should always get it as a feedback. It's never, I would say, that is never an order, like do that. It's most of the times that arrives to you in that form, but I would always detach from the roles and take it as a feedback. Take it just as a group of users or one of the major stakeholders into the game, of course, with respect. That's not what I'm not saying like you should never listen to VCs, but I would detach the roles and stick to what is that they are proposing. What is the feedback? Is this in line with the vision? Is this becoming a different thing? Are we still aligned? These are crucial questions to ask in these stages. If you deciding to stick to the vision, it's almost like two people that are married and they are asking themselves like, are we still in love? That's how I see it, and that's probably I think that this tells everything. That's how I see it.
Yeah, no, I like that example of, I think, I would just sum it up and I would just say, I think transparency, right? Like just be transparent with the VC about how you're progressing, what are the challenges that are coming, what are the changes. You're going to have to pivot sometimes, but sometimes you're going to have to make that hard decision to not pivot and stick to your original vision. I know that Mark and I have talked about this on our prior live streams about sometimes he's had to make hard decisions, and that maybe wasn't going to sit well with the investors, but he has to follow to a certain extent his intuition and his experience in making some of these difficult decisions. And there are sometimes you just can't please everybody, right? So transparency, just lean into that. And what were you going to say? You were going to say something.
Yeah, no, 100% transparency and hard decisions, of course. I just want to add, like, it's anyway, it all has to go back to the let's say major theory of change management. When it's effectively that. If you're talking about pivot management, it's like change management. It's the same. That can be a radical change, can be an incremental change, can be a data-driven decision. there are, of course, a lot of components involved: emotional, product, the team morale, data from the market. There can be many different opportunities, threats to the business that make you made the decision to pivot. And but in reality, it shouldn't be like a bad thing. It should be just adapting. It's about change management. We always need to change. We always need to stay up to date. We always need to be on top of the market trends, on top of what's going on, and remembering what we're doing, remembering where our user base, where the investors, how aligned we are, where we're going, but still keeping it all together. It's change management at the end of the day.
That's a great perspective. That's a good way of looking at it, right? And I like how you said whether it's a big change or a little change. The principles, I think, for navigating these tricky situations are pretty much the same, right? You still want to continue to stick to your values. I love everything you said, Nick. So can you share an example of maybe a startup that did a good job at balancing, VC expectations, maybe, or their own original vision, or even with user needs? You have competing interests. You might have a VC saying one thing, you might have your initial users wanting something else, and your original vision. So maybe you could share an example of a startup to help kind of hammer that point home.
Yeah, I want to connect this probably when you were posing the question. I reminded about the discussion we had the previous live stream, and we discussed about it. So that radical ideas, radical new ideas are the ones that are non-consensus are right. Like Airbnb, it was when they started, like you're gonna stay at somebody else's house. This was their statement. And 15 years ago, the answer would have been like, are you nuts? I'm not gonna be in the house of a person I don't know. Why should I be there? And how is that gonna look like? Am I going to use their stuff, and how that works, and so on? There was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of uncertainty, risks, and that is just the other side of lack of trust. And to build trust, when you have to build conviction into something, you have to start aligning around. You have to generate. You have to strategize around not only the vision, but also the value to the users, and remain adapted to that. So you have to see this from the perspective of the users. You have to see this from the perspective of customers, and customers simply needed a way so that they could trust people they didn't know. So trust and safety initiatives started at Airbnb. There was host insurance for who's hosting the people, and there were like a collection of IDs to verify the identity of people, to know who these people were. There were targeted marketing analysis and expansion, and the application of everything that was known in the hospitality industry to this new side of the hospitality, effectively. So most of the people that were, people understand very well what is familiar to them, and that is a sort of building trust and building like removing the boundaries, removing the barriers to accepting something new. And everything that was known and that worked well until then in the hospitality industry was brought into this Airbnb, including also all the advantages of the Web 2.0, which were related to community building, engagement, and blogs, and putting users together to discuss, understand, and that's it. Like building trust, putting together things that are gonna make a big wild idea accessible and comprehensible and accessible to everybody.
Yeah. Great insights. And again, every situation is different, right? So you have to do a balancing. It's like there's no black and white kind of approach, but you gave some great tips for people to keep in mind. But I'm going to put my next, we're getting close to our time. So for my last question, I'm going to put my chief culture hat on for a second. And my question is, these times that we're talking about when you have different needs from the users or your VCs, these can be really difficult, right? These demands can be challenging. And so what are some ways to manage team morale and focus during these situations? Or let's say you decide to make a pivot. Right. And so what are some ways that, we should keep in mind as founders, as builders, when we're going through these pivots, that it's important that we continue to build team morale so that we have a smooth transition and continue, producing, continue building. So what are some tips that you have for us?
That's a very nice question. Thank you, Sejal. So as I said before, pivot for me equals change, and change leads me directly to change management. And the way you make a change to happen, it's always with inclusive decision making and very clear communication. You have to be very clear, set expectations, or sometimes it might be, since it's a pivot and it's done on a new venture, maybe it's an unprecedented situation by design, by definition. But there are strategies and basically you're building a new plan and a new path forward, and you are going to communicate this to the people who are going to execute the plan. That's how I would simplify it and see it from a logical perspective. Then there is, of course, an emotional component to that, because change is always, something that may not be as as welcomed by certain personality type people. There are people who love change, embrace change. There are people who feel very uncomfortable with that, and that is just normal. That is part of the how we are as humans. We are technically the most evolved among the humans are the ones who can adapt to change, but also the limbic brain is the one saying no, I don't want change. First reaction is panicking. First reaction is rejecting. Then knowing more about what's going on. So clear communication, again, one can consider the change and can see that is actually achievable, feasible. You're part of the plan, and inclusive decision making, it's even better. Not always possible, but even better. And that's basically what could help maintain not only the morale, but make a team stronger.
I love all of that. Yeah, I'm glad you said something about the emotional support. I think it's really important that for some people, this is a very stressful time, when you're going through a change or a pivot. Tough decisions have to be made, and so I think it's important to provide that support to people, whether it's check-ins, team building activities, providing access to mental health resources. I think we do such a great job of that at Nobody Studios. We do our Meditate to Innovate sessions. We do Nobody Nexus events. We do cultural intelligence series, right, to help people kind of understand and be ready to deal with these situations. I just wanted to I think what you said, something that really jumped out at me, it's the transparency. Again, going back to the transparency is, I think it's important to keep everybody informed to the extent you can, right? I mean, there's some things that are hard to keep informed, because you don't know all the answers. But I think you have to do your best to keep people in the loop so that they're not just, creating things. They're able to manage it better. And that creates trust too, right? So that they can, and it reduces that level of uncertainty. And I always tell, everybody that all the founders and people that I talk to about this is that I think it's important to remind ourselves, when we're going through these pivots, of what is the vision? Like, what is that long-term vision? And how does this pivot align with that company's, vision or mission that they're trying to do? Because sometimes that during the pivot gets lost about now we're pivoting. We're kind of going away from our mission. And I think it's important to draw that link for people to say, no, this is actually going to help us get closer to our goal, right? It's just we're changing direction like we have to do in order to evolve and grow, and we have to be adaptable, right? But then, once these decisions are made, I think it's important to build that team morale. So thank you so much. You said so many wonderful things. I always learn so much from you, Nick, when you join us on these live streams. So I hope you'll come back and join us again soon. Thank you for everybody else that has joined us here today. Our chief nobody wasn't feeling well, so I gave him a pass and I said, why don't you worry about taking care of yourself? Nick and I got this. And I think we did a great job, Nick, at sharing some important information. Is there anything else you want to add before we sign out for today?
Thank you for all the words, all the kind words, as usual. Thank you for being the amazing host you are all the time with these the making of a nobody. And I just would like to add one more thing around the the transparency and the communication plan and so on, because I tend to be very logical and I tend to put it into plan and execution and so on. But the worst thing one can do is neglecting emotions. Emotions are there, they must be acknowledged, and they must be explored as well. And it's so important, because that's how burnout happens. That's how people explode if they can't do that, if they don't manage that. And it's so important. We are souls and have a body, not vice versa. So it's super important. It's super important that our emotions are taken into account and managed just like everything else. So that is also part of it. It's a good occasion when these changes are happening to also make one more step as a team to grow towards this path and knowing more about self-awareness, understand where we are and what we can do about it, and so on. So it's always an occasion for growth. That's what I wanted to close.
Love it. Well, I'm a huge cheerleader for you and William Carbone and the Evalify team. You guys are crushing it, and standing here and just watching your journey unfold is honestly probably one of the best highlights of my career, Nick. So I'm new to the whole startup space. Before Nobody Studios, I'd worked with some clients, but actually being in the trenches and building together and to have people like you to build with has been just a total pleasure. And I learned so much. So that's part of my journey as I evolve, is I get to, pick the brains of brilliant minds like you and William and everybody else. So thank you again for joining us, everybody. We do these every Friday. So we'll be back again next Friday. And I think Mark and Andy will be joining me again next week with some other topics. But remember, as I mentioned, I try to bring this up often, is that we want this to be an interactive series. So shoot me a message. You can message me on LinkedIn or reach out to me or anybody else, Mark or Andy, and let us know if you've got some ideas, because we want to give you information, which is one way of raising awareness, but it's also a way for us to share what we're doing and how we're building. So let us know what you want to hear about so we can make sure that we give you what you want, right? So thank you for joining us today. Have a great week, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.